Hello, everyone. This is going to be 10.1 American Indians Under Pressure. So, we're going to be looking at both Native Americans and the expansion westward of white people during this time period post Civil War. We're going to start with a quote from a Native American named Red Cloud, who said, "They made us many promises, they being white settlers, more than I can remember, but they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it." So, our objectives here, we are going to compare the way Native Americans and white settlers viewed and used land, especially in the West. We are going to describe conflicts between white settlers and Native Americans, analyze the impact of Indian wars, and evaluate the effectiveness of the government's Americanization and reservation policies towards American Indians in this time period. So, let's look at how Native American cultures are being forced to adapt to the new settlers in the West. So, by the end of the Civil War, most Native Americans had moved west of the Mississippi, which kind of makes sense. They'd been pushed west of the Mississippi. And although we're going to be talking about Native Americans in very generalized terms in this section, it's important again to remember that there is no one group of Native Americans. There are many groups of Native Americans, all of them very different, different beliefs, different geographical locations, different languages, different ways of life, very different. It's a bad thing to start just speaking generalizations. So many native tribes had their differences, and many of them, these differences were based on geography. So we have tribes of the Northwest living, hunting, fishing, living near usually the rivers of what is modern day Oregon and Washington. We have people living in the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona, tribes like the Pueblo and the Navajo. The Navajo were a bit more mobile. They had not settled at this point. They lived in mud huts that could be abandoned pretty quickly. So here is a member of the Shasta tribe in the American Northwest. Here is some Pueblo cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde National Park. By the time these were found in the early 1900s, they had been abandoned for a while. Now, most of the native tribes that lived west of the Mississippi were nomads. They moved from place to place and mainly lived in the Great Plains. So we're talking about the Sioux, the Blackfeet, the Crow, the Cheyenne, the Comanche tribes such as this. And they were known for being very good horsemen. Remember, horses had not arrived until the Europeans arrived, but once the Native Americans got their hands on horses, they got very good at it. And many of them used horses to hunt the bison. The bison are the main source of food and clothing, lodging. They used every single part of the bison that they could. And most tribes also had a very strong religious connection to nature, spiritually. They also viewed themselves as a part of nature, but not separate from it. Most white people saw land and nature as a resource instead of something that they're connected with. So here's a painting by the great Western painter Frederick Remington of what's called the buffalo hunt. And here is a bison crossing the road. Pro tip, do not try to, if you see a bison crossing the road, just wait your turn. The bison weighs more than your car, and it will end badly for you if you try to move the bison. So, starting in the early 1800s, white settlers began moving west and moving Native Americans off of what was considered white land. Andrew Jackson, we talked about him with the Trail of Tears. Treaties were signed to make sure that um, white people stayed off of Cherokee land. However, as time went on, those treaties were ignored. And in the 1850s, discoveries of gold and silver in the West tempted people onto this native property again. And so by the 1860s and afterwards, most tribes had been moved onto private pieces of land that were set aside by the government for Native American use called reservations. Now, they were expected to stay on that land and not move off of it. So, really quick, here's an example of starting in the late 1770s and moving up through the 1880s, just how much land used to be owned by Native Americans, that's in the blue, and how much land is there is at the end of the 1870s, which is the red. So, moving people to reservations made holding on to the way of life of a lot of Native Americans very difficult, near impossible. Remember, they're nomadic people going after herds of bison. It's hard to do that when you are constrained to one piece of land. Along with this, they lost their culture, they lost their way of life. White settlers also had a bad habit of introducing diseases for which Native Americans had little to no immunity, meaning that, a European disease that is considered commonplace today could be devastating back in this time period. White settlers also tended to destroy bison herds on purpose. They're doing this on purpose, uh, driving the bison to near extinction. This got rid of pretty much everything that Native Americans used for a way of life. So here are a pile of bison skulls in 1870. Many of them would just be shot from trains and left for dead. These skulls, however, are going to be ground up and used for fertilizer. Now, let's look at settlers and Native Americans colliding during this time, the collision of different ways of life. So, advancements in communication and transportation following the Civil War, that plus the fact that it was easier and, without slavery, more people were moving to the Great Plains, um, it seemed more likely that these two groups, white settlers and Native Americans, would interact and come into conflict. We also see that new industries like mining and cattle ranching are making people want to move west more. And so, as Americans began to move west, they ignored the fact that they're moving on to land that was promised to Native Americans by treaties. And in 1862, the Sioux, that's how you say that word, by the way, Sioux, they fought against white settlers encroaching on their land. They killed over 400 white settlers, including women and children. In response to this, the government sent out army troops. And in 1864, the federal troops killed about 150 to around 200 Native American men, women, and children at a place called the Sand Creek in Colorado. This is called the Sand Creek Massacre. After the Civil War was done, American troops were sent out to deal with the rest of the Native American tribes, put them onto reservations or end them, basically. So, this is the site of the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. In 1868, trying to stop the killing on both sides because both sides were getting killed pretty well, the U.S. government offered a peace treaty called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. They promised the Sioux that they would be able to hold on to the Black Hills of South Dakota, which was sacred territory for their tribe, and the U.S. government would abandon their forts, and that the natives would receive government support as long as they stayed on the reservation. However, most tribes who signed these sorts of treaties were disappointed by the fact that the government did not support them or supported them very little, and also about the fact that people kept moving on their land. A lot of their government assistance ended up being stolen, taken, ignored. It was not a great way of life for Native Americans. Now, let's look at the conclusion of Indian Wars. The position of Native Americans became one that it was untenable. They could not hold on to it anymore. They were getting diseases. They were sick. They were not getting the support from the American government that they expected, and their way of life was disappearing. And so, in frustration, some Native Americans turned to violence. We see here, for instance, in 1863, Kit Carson was sent west to do battle with the Navajo. He was a frontiersman, Kit Carson was, and he used very total war, end of Civil War tactics to go after them. He burned villages, burned crops, until the 8,000 Navajos surrendered. And after that, he moved the Navajo into New Mexico on what's called the Long Walk of the Navajo. The land that the Navajo lived on was not good for farming. It was not good for surviving. It was basically a desert. And they were in constant danger from the Apache, who were an enemy tribe. And so after 4 years, the government moved them again. But this long walk is considered almost the Trail of Tears for Western Native Americans. So this is the long walk starting in Fort Defiance and moving into Fort Sumner in New Mexico territory right down there in the bottom right. And here are some of the natives on the long walk. Now, in the southern plains, natives like the Kiowa and the Comanche lost their battles to the federal government troops who settled them in West Texas and basically killed all the southern buffalo. We were inches away from the total extinction of the American bison. There were only about 1,000 left before we saved them. And very quickly, all the Comanche either surrendered or were killed as they had run out of food, basically. Now, when the prospect of gold, people heard about gold in South Dakota, um, a lot of white people moved to the Black Hills of South Dakota looking for gold in violation of the treaties. And so Sioux leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull tried to get rid of them. In 1876, the Sioux ambushed a large contingent of American soldiers, including the General George Custer and his men, at what's called the Battle of Little Bighorn, and killed every last one of them. And this was the last great victory of the Native Americans. After this, and after the people back east heard about this massacre of white troops, they decided to crack down on the natives. And so here is Chief Crazy Horse, who allegedly shouted, "Today is a good day to die," as he rode into battle at Little Bighorn. He did not die at Little Bighorn, though. This is also, you can see the larger statue being made of Crazy Horse. This is right down the road from Mount Rushmore. This is George Custer, who was a major general. He was alive from 1839 to 76, from Ohio. He was a Civil War veteran and explorer. He graduated near the bottom of his class in West Point, but served with McClellan during the Civil War and became known as sort of an Indian fighter out west. Custer and his men were buried near the site of the massacre. However, his body was later moved to West Point Cemetery. And here is Sitting Bull. His Native American name is Tatanka Iotake. He lived from 1831 to 1890. He was born in the Dakota Territories. He was a Lakota Sioux leader and holy man. He was a religious leader along with being a political leader. And he fought at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and afterwards he joined up with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And after that, he retired to a reservation where he was shot and killed by Indian police during what is called the Ghost Dance Rebellion. He was killed by them. So here's a painting of Custer's Last Stand that really shows the difference in how Custer is portrayed and represented. Over time, the image of Custer has changed from being this heroic martyr for Western expansion to someone who's a bit more reckless, dangerous, and perhaps was goading Native Americans into a fight, more or less. Now, we also see the Nez Perce Indians are another group of Native Americans during this time. They were forced off their land in Idaho. They had actually hoped that they had accepted Christianity and settled in large farms, hoping that if they adapted into the white culture, that they would stop getting their land taken away. However, they did get their land taken away, and so Chief Joseph led several Nez Perce refugees away from the troops, hoping to get to Canada, but they wouldn't let him go, and so he was caught and he was forced back into reservations in Oklahoma. So here's Chief Joseph, who said, "We gave up some of our country to the white men, thinking that we could then have peace. We were mistaken. The white man would not let us alone." Finally, in the face of all this, many Native Americans reverted to old time, you know, very fundamentalist Native American beliefs called the ghost dance. They believed that if they returned to their old ways of life and their old ways of religion, that the ghost dance would banish whites from their land and restore bison to the way of life. Um, this was also a physical rebellion as well, though, and to stop this rebellion, the government ambushed and killed many Native American tribes, especially in 1890. They killed Chief Sitting Bull. And then they continued chasing after the Sioux. They killed over 100 men, women, and children at a place called Wounded Knee. And this marked the end of Native American resistance to whites in the West. So here is a picture taken at Wounded Knee, a mass grave of the Lakota Sioux. This was on December 29th, 1890. Now, let's look at assimilation very quickly. So the American government was trying to move all Native Americans onto government reservation land. This didn't work very well, and so many whites hoped that as the buffalo died, then the old native ways of life would die too, and that they would assimilate, meaning they would sort of blend in and adopt the culture and the civilization of white people. There were a few people who spoke up against the treatment of Native Americans, saying that they should be treated better, that they're being forced off land, that we had made treaties and promised to them. They wrote books like A Century of Dishonor, which attacked white policies of dealing with Native American rights. This was written by a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson, who said, "There is not among these 300 bands of Indians one which has not suffered cruelty at the hands either of the government or of white settlers. The poorer, the more insignificant, the more helpless the band, the more certain the cruelty to which they have been subjected. It makes little difference where one opens the record of history of the Indians. Every page and every year has its dark stain." Now, in 1871, tribes were dissolved in the eyes of the federal government. They said, "You're no longer tribes, you are now just people." And Native Americans were now dealt with as individuals. They lost their tribal ability to barter with the U.S. government, and this very much weakened their political power and also their native culture. Now, reformers thought that they could Americanize the natives faster if they gave up their tribal bonds and also if they gave up their tribal culture. In 1887, the Dawes Act was passed, which encouraged Native Americans to become private property owners instead of tribal property owners. And reservations were split up into family plots, most of which were not, unfortunately, big enough to support a family. Native Americans still tried to practice their feasts, their dances, and their funerals, but they were outlawed by the Dawes Act. They were forced to give up their culture, their religion, their languages, and forced assimilation into white culture. Many children in this time were also sent to white-run boarding schools like the Carlisle Indian School, and they would be punished for showing their Native American heritage during this time. So here is a flag of the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. These are three young boys who went into the Carlisle Indian School. We see them at the beginning of their schooling and at the end of their schooling, and you can see just how much has changed during this time period. The motto of the Carlisle Indian School was to kill the Indian and save the man, basically to kill the Native American portion of the Indians and save the sort of white soul within them.